Good afternoon, and welcome back to City Club of Portland's Friday Forums, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Sue Thomas, president of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KPBS radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining us today, this Friday, September 11th, for the first forum of the fall. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the significance of today's date. 8 years ago on this day, America watched in shock as terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. Almost 3,000 people died as a direct result of these attacks. Let us take a moment of silence to commemorate the victims of September 11th and those who have died in Iraq and Afghanistan since then. Thank you. Today's City Club welcomes 4 Oregon legislators who will share their experiences as first-time legislators or committee chairs during Oregon's 75th session. But first, some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask that everyone in the room please silence your cell phones or other devices that make noise. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors for this quarter, without whose generous financial support, these time-honored City Club luncheons would not be possible. Our corporate sponsors for this quarter are the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the law firm of Stoll Reeves. Please join me in thanking our sponsors. And just before we begin our program, I'd like to welcome City Club's President-elect Sharon Van Sickle-Robbins to the podium. Sharon?
Hello. As president-elect of City Club, one of my responsibilities is to oversee the club's annual fund drive, which is being launched this month. Some of you may have already received your letters in the mail. The campaign is a critical component of the club's operating budget, comprising almost 25% of our annual revenues. Your support of the club's work through your contribution to the annual fund will help us nourish and sustain a strong community through active and informed citizens. As American novelist Martha Gellern once remarked, citizenship is a tough occupation which obliges the citizen to make his own informed opinion and stand by it. For almost 95 years, the City Club of Portland has been providing citizens with invaluable on-the-job training for what I believe is one of the most important jobs we ever hold. I hope you'll support the club's work by making a generous contribution to the annual fund. And if you'd like to take care of it today, there are contribution envelopes placed conveniently on every table. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And now on to today's program. New eyes often bring fresh perspectives to an issue. These new viewpoints can result in great changes when the issues are those like healthcare, transportation, or the economy that affect our daily lives, and when those newcomers have the power to shape public policy. Today's City Club welcomes 4 young state representatives who will discuss whether young leaders tend to think differently or have different policy preferences than their older counterparts. They will address their experiences working with legislators on the other side of the aisle, and will talk about both the opportunities and the pitfalls of the near total control of the party which they represent. Our first speaker today will be Tobias Reed. Representative Reed earned his master's degree in business administration at the University of Washington. He served as a development officer for Willamette University and currently develops kids' footwear for Nike. He was elected 2 years ago to Southwest Portland District 27. He chairs the House Sustainability and Economic Development Committee and is a member of both the House Revenue and Rules Committees. Tobias Reed and his wife are expecting their first child at any moment, so if you see him rush out of the room, that's probably why. Today's second speaker is Representative Ben Cannon, who is serving his second term representing Portland's Eastside House District 46. He is chair of the Environment and Water Committee and also serves on the House Healthcare Committee. A native Portlander, Ben received a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, and another in education at England's Oxford University. In addition to serving in the state legislature, Ben teaches humanities to 6th through 8th graders at the Arbor School of Arts and Sciences, an elementary school in Tualatin. Chris Garrett, our third speaker this afternoon, is a native to Portland's Southwest House District 38, which he was elected to represent in November of 2008. Chris earned his law degree at the University of Chicago Law School and now practices with the law firm of Perkins Coie. As representative, he serves on the interim House Judiciary and Healthcare Committees and was recently appointed to Sustainability and Economic Development Committee. In June 2009, Chris was elected Assistant Majority Leader by the House Democratic colleagues. Our final speaker today is another Portland native, Jules Kopel Bailey. Representative Bailey received his master's degree at Princeton University, where he studied public affairs and urban and regional planning. When he was a senior policy analyst at Echo Northwest, he tackled assignments that included an economic impact projection for the Portland high-performance green building policy and analysis of the system of carbon taxes for the state. He now runs his own consulting practice. In 2008, Jules Kopel Bailey was elected as representative to Portland's Inner East Side District 42. And now, please help me welcome our first speaker of the day, Representative Tobias Reed.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and I can't think of a better spot to be on a date such as today when we are continuing to bring policy discussions before the public and building community. I'm especially grateful for the way you've chosen to do that today by bringing some of the newer voices in the legislature into the conversation. And I'm proud to be with my colleagues here, whom I consider among the most talented in the legislature, but I do have to confess I have a little trepidation in being the first speaker amongst this group. But I'm hoping I can set a bar that they can easily exceed. And after that, I'll sit down, because I think I'm as eager as you are, perhaps even more, to absorb some of their wisdom. So what I'd like to try to do in a few minutes is put some words to some of the lessons I've learned in my 2 sessions in the legislature and try to draw some conclusions about where we are as a state and where we'd like to go. I'm not sure whether you'll be disappointed or excited to hear it, but I'm planning to talk more about themes than specific issues, because I have a lot of confidence in the folks who are coming after me. And to start, I think it's worth setting some context about the 2 sessions that I've been part of. 2007 was obviously a different experience when we spent most of our time talking about how to invest our shared resources. I think we did a good job of that, but it's a very different experience than the session just concluded, where we spent a lot of our time trying to figure out how to protect vital services like K-12 education and public safety. But what's common in those 2 experiences is something that I think is really central to Oregon's past and to our future. It's innovation. That's really central, I think, to who we are. We're here at the end of a trail with which we share a name. It was traveled by people who were convinced that something better lay over the horizon at the end of the trail, and we see it on the jerseys of our professional basketball franchise. We see it in policy, too. We're justifiably proud of our role as pioneers on policies like the bottle bill and public beaches, and it's something that is really central to who we are. I heard the joke go around that Oregon likes to be first to do something or last to do something and nothing in between. But even in that joke, I think there's some truth, because we like to figure out how to do things first or to do it better than those who've gone before us. In fact, innovation really is one of the key reasons I ran for the legislature. At the time, I found it hard to think of examples of that kind of innovation, creativity, and collaboration that had come since the bottle bill and public beaches. The good news now is that there are lots of examples of that kind of work, whether it's updating that original bottle bill, the renewable energy standard, creative funding mechanisms for energy efficiency projects, the rainy day fund. It's a long list, but our work is obviously not done, and I hope it continues because we always have to be seeking new and innovative ways to do things. But being innovative requires some things of us. Requires a willingness to confront entrenched interests, even when there are friends and even when we have common goals. I think Edmund Burke had it right when he said, "A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation." And in that respect, the people before you today have some advantages. Because we're newer, we're less committed to the way we've always done things and more willing to try new things. But at the same time, this newness can be a disadvantage. Unless we're on our games, articulate, smart, well-prepared, we can easily be dismissed as being too new to be taken seriously. And even if we are well-prepared, organized, smart, articulate, all those things, Thinking too far outside the box can be hazardous to one's political health. Doing it in the name of innovation or any other good cause doesn't make it any less so. So I think it's up to all of us to support policymakers who are willing to think out of the box, to be creative and be innovative. Like a lot of legislators, I send out an electronic newsletter to constituents from time to time, and I can recall towards the end of this session quoting that old political truth that if you've upset both sides of an issue about equally, it's a clue that you might be on the right track. I felt that acutely on several issues this session, but it also gave me a chance to forge some unique alliances on both sides of the aisle. And I would say part of my approach is compromise, but another is to try to move beyond the game that politics often tries to push us into of who wins and who loses, and find win-win solutions. To move beyond, for example, that false choice between economic development and environmental protection. We have to continue to seek new ways of doing things, better ways that are more effective, more efficient, even as doing so is uncomfortable. To think in terms of the long run, as I think we all should and must do, is to think in terms of relationships. Avoid making permanent allies and permanent enemies. Cultivate the relationships. And we have to get more comfortable, all of us, in disagreeing with each other without damaging those relationships. Even in the midst of the most contentious and intense debate, I think it's wise to remember what John Kenneth Galbraith said, that faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving that there's no need to do so, almost everybody gets busy on the proof. There's surely some danger in putting these sorts of philosophical statements out there, but they are a fair representation of the kinds of things I'm thinking about as we move from this session back to our districts and begin thinking about what's next for Oregon. And as we do that, I want to urge all of us to resist the temptation to look just at the ground in front of us and keep an eye on the horizon. It's tempting to look at what's in front of us. It's immediate, it's tangible, and a lot of people are hurting. But I think the key in addressing those challenges and preventing their reoccurrence, or at least lessening the chance, is to keep an eye on the horizon and think about what sort of Oregon we want to leave to our kids, our grandkids, and future generations. There are tough things in front of us, and there's no way to go around that. But I think we can draw strength and unity from those challenges. I think a lot these days about a speech that President Kennedy gave in Houston in 1962. I was not alive for that, and I don't think any of my colleagues up here were, but some of you were, and I bet some of you remember this speech. He said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too." We've got similar challenges, and while there's no doubt this was a tough session, I feel very good about the future of Oregon, in no small part because of the people who are here and the others in the legislature. And I have new commitment to that work. You've already heard about some of the reason, but my wife and I are expecting our first child in a few days, so we're excited about that. And I don't think there's any better reason to be committed to this sort of work. With that, let me thank you for the work you do, for the conversation going forward, and express my gratitude to my colleagues who are here, those also who are not here, all of whom are working hard for a better state. I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from the great American philosopher Will Rogers, who said that even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. Thanks a lot.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and honor to be at the City Club today, partly because one of the very first things I did after resettling in Portland 7 years ago was to join the City Club and get involved in a research committee related to early childhood education. Its chair, Julie Young, was a big part of that, and that experience helped motivate me to run for the legislature. So it's good to be back. So first of all, I want to let you in on what I think may be the legislature's biggest secret. It was certainly a surprise to me. The members of Oregon's legislature, Republicans and Democrats, are, by and large, an extraordinarily talented group. My colleagues here today are among the brightest, most knowledgeable, dedicated, youngish people that I have known. And just to give you a flavor of some of the others, the folks with whom we serve, medical researcher turned small businessman, former police lieutenants and state troopers, A legislative member with years of experience running arts-related nonprofits, former school principals, practicing college teachers, successful business people, just to name a few. Contrary to the public's impression, the legislature is blessed with talent. So what do we do with all that talent? Well, I'm going to spend my time talking about a couple of the things that we do well and then turn to some of our challenges. It's been surprising to me just how much of the state's business the legislature manages to get done every session. Public attention focuses on the controversial bills and issues, but in each of my 2 sessions, the overwhelming majority of our work is collaborative, it's constructive, and it results in bills that pass with unanimous or near unanimous votes on the floor. This is the hard work, often technical work, vital work of updating Oregon's shelf full of laws, of statutes, and it goes largely unnoticed. Of course, this isn't all we do, and I know that because I chair the Environment and Water Committee. And if there were ever issues that are bound to be lightning rods for controversy, they're issues related to the environment and water. So I want to talk about a couple of the environmental bills that we managed to pass this session. I think part of their significance is the fact that even when it comes to what is perhaps, after taxes, the most contentious area of Oregon politics, bipartisan majorities reached the conclusion that we could take meaningful steps to improve the environment and create jobs. First of all, in Oregon, in 2009, we became just the 2nd state in the country to adopt a low-carbon fuel standard. This law will ensure that by 2020, the average gallon of fuel will be responsible for 10% less greenhouse gas emissions than the average gallon of fuel does today. Same energy output, but 10% fewer emissions associated with the full life cycle of the fuel, including its production, its transportation, and its combustion. Under this type of analysis, we'll compare, for example, biofuels produced in the Midwest from corn with biofuels produced in Oregon from farm or forest byproducts. The law should give a big leg up to the latter and help do for Oregon's emerging biomass, cellulosic ethanol, and electric vehicle industries what federal farm and ethanol policies have done for Iowa corn farmers. Second bill I want to talk about, it was a major environmental accomplishment, a bill that one longtime water lobbyist called the most significant and positive piece of water legislation in the last 20 years. The context for this is that historically, Oregon fails to fund water projects. We get stalemated, caught up between urban and rural interests, water users and environmentalists, Democrats and Republicans, and those who take a short-term view of water needs versus those who look to the future. This session, the 2 vice chairs of my committee, freshman Democrat Jefferson Smith from East Portland and longtime Republican Bob Jensen from Pendleton, formed the legislature's odd couple. Their teamwork over many months resulted in a bill that helps Oregon move forward on funding win-win-win water projects, projects that are good for the economy, good for the environment, and fiscally responsible for the state. As a result, Umatilla Basin will receive loan and grant funding for the next phase of their aquifer recharge project. The state will finally gain an integrated water strategy, and water users will have an established pathway for funding future projects. These are just 2 out of the dozens of environmental bills that we passed this session. Of course, there were some disappointments too, but the legislature's environmental work this session helped reinforce my impression that overall, the legislature does surprisingly well with discrete issues that are immediately before it. So what then are our challenges? What do we not do so well? I think that even if the public were to accept my conclusion that the legislature does a decent job of dealing with short-term challenges, there would remain a sense that our work tends to miss the bigger picture. And I think that to a large extent that would be right. For the fact is that our legislature is lacking in the resources, the institutional habits, and the authority to squarely address many of the state's larger challenges. So let's take environmental issues. It's one thing to ban a particular chemical, as we did with a toxic flame retardant this session, important, good bill. It would be quite another to establish a system of chemical regulation to deal comprehensively and fairly with thousands upon thousands of chemicals. And that challenge pales in comparison with the challenge of establishing a stable and equitable system of public finance, or creating a comprehensive high-quality early care and education system, or lowering health costs that are crippling the public and private sector, or putting a serious dent in drug and alcohol addiction. And I could go on and on and on. So why does the legislature seem so ill-equipped to deal with these bigger problems? Well, partly it's about resources. We expect the legislature to make headway on society's most tenacious problems, but only for 6 months or so out of every 2 years. We have invested in very little professional policy staff. These problems are tough, and they require a tremendous amount of expertise. Very often, the folks in Salem who have that expertise are the lobbyists who are paid to promote one view or another. But it's not only about resources. It's about some of our legislative habits. Pressed for time and pressed by lobbyists, we're too quick to delegate tough decisions to others. When difficult issues come up in committee, it's routine to us for us to ask opposing stakeholders to work it out in the hallway, then come back in with an agreement. I know because I've done it. And when it works, perhaps it's a decent way of doing business. But too often it doesn't work. Stakeholders fail to agree, and so we move on without acting. The public's business may not get done. So it's about resources and habits, but it's also about the limited authority of the legislature to deal squarely with our challenges. As a City Club audience probably knows, Oregon's Constitution is riddled with provisions designed to weaken the legislature or, depending on your point of view, protect the public from us. We're cowed by an initiative and referendum system that rewards poll readers, not problem solvers. Take the budget. Under our Constitution, the legislature doesn't really draw up a budget. We color a budget in. Much of that outline has been drawn up for us. On the revenue side, the kicker has made it next to impossible to build reserves that are sufficient to lessen the volatility of our income tax-dependent system. On the spending side, the Constitution divvies up more than $2 billion per biennium before the legislature has even begun to meet. And that's before you get to large swaths of the budget that aren't in the Constitution, but are protected by supermajority requirements that are. Take the $30 billion in tax breaks that Oregon provides every year, twice the amount of our general fund. The majority of these serve noble and important purposes. But why should it be the case that in order to reduce a tax break, even slightly, requires a supermajority in both chambers? Or take our mandatory minimum sentences. Again, they result from a reasonable response by voters to unfairness in our sentencing laws, but have resulted in a prison building policy that helps make Oregon the only state west of the Mississippi that spends more on prisons than on higher ed. Why should it be the case to change those laws, even slightly, requires a supermajority in both chambers? All of which is just to suggest that Oregon's legislature doesn't have as much independent capacity to solve tough problems as I think our constituents expect and deserve. So who's going to take on the challenge of reshaping the ways in which we govern ourselves? Who's going to help us face these challenges? The answer in Oregon is that it can't be legislators alone. We need the business community, advocacy groups, civic organizations, and engaged citizens. But legislators, too, have to play an important part. After all, as leaders, our job is not to blame voters, but to understand them. And our obligation is not merely to follow public opinion, but to help shape it. While we can't change the Constitution, we can ask voters to. We can make the case for more expertise in the legislative branch. And over time, we can change the political culture. We can talk directly and honestly with the public about the challenges we face and ask other leaders to do the same. I appreciate the opportunity the City Club creates for that kind of dialogue, and I look forward to the discussion that's to come. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Compared to the two speakers you're about to hear, the two who you just heard are grizzled veterans of the legislative process. The two rookies go next, and I would say that Ben and Tobias tower over us, but I don't believe in cheap humor. So, thank you again for the privilege of being here to speak today. As a longtime member and listener of the City Club, I never thought I might have the pleasure of actually speaking to you from the podium, and it's an honor especially to be here with three of my favorite and most talented colleagues in the House. In my first session, starting in January, I thought often about some advice I got when I was a brand new lawyer almost a decade ago. I started my career at a large firm in New York, and each associate who started there was assigned to a partner as a mentor. Mine took me to lunch and said, "I'm going to give you the same advice I got. Really just two things you need to know right now. First, back at the office, every single person you see, every partner, every associate, every paralegal, and especially every secretary, knows a hell of a lot more than you about the practice of law. Two, don't worry about it. Nobody expects anything from you." It occurred to me many times as a freshman legislator that the same advice could be given, except for the second part, because a lot of people expect a lot of things from us, especially the 60,000 plus people who we represent. And they should, because we spent the better part of a year telling them how much better things would be if they would just elect us to the legislature. But in fact, when you get to the Capitol and you start to look around, you see that every person who you see, every member, staff person, every lobbyist knows much more than you do about the practice of legislating. And they know more than you. And they know that they know more than you. And they don't expect much from you except perhaps that you listen to them. And I would also say that we as a group of new legislators are also a fairly competitive and ambitious bunch, and we have high expectations of ourselves. And so the pressure to perform is great, as is the pressure to keep your mouth shut more often than not while you listen and learn. Fortunately, the legislature is a place where you have no choice but to learn quickly. The workload is large and the pace is fast. About 95% of our work is done in committee, where you're one of a handful of people shaping legislation. We deal with thousands of bills, most of us having just a staff of 1 or 2 people to sort through everything, in addition to all the other work that makes up a legislative day, like meetings, correspondence, and other constituent work. As daunting as all of this can be for a new member, it also validated my reasons for running. I ran because I believed, based on my observations as a staffer in 2 previous sessions, that the legislature is truly a place where an individual can make a difference. And after my first session, I believe that more than ever. Now, we were invited today to speak particularly about our impressions as new and younger members, and I'm going to touch on 2 questions that I commonly hear and an observation, all of which I think are especially important to you as the City Club. The first has to do with partisanship, and how bad is it? My answer is not nearly as bad as most people probably think. Of course it exists, but the media often would have us believe that the legislature is a bitter and angry and polarized place where the parties fight constantly and often for its own sake. That just isn't true, not this session at least, where the Democrats and Republicans worked together collegially and respectfully, even when they were ultimately unable to agree. The best example I can think of is the work that we did in the Healthcare Committee, where Ben Cannon and I served with 4 other Democrats and 4 Republicans, and spent most of the session working on major healthcare system reform and a coverage expansion for low-income children and families funded by a provider tax. Republicans and Democrats had clear differences of opinion on these issues. We simply approached the issue from very different philosophical places. But I really believe that if most Oregonians could have observed the workings of that committee, they would have been proud. Day after day, the Republicans and Democrats argued heatedly about the merits of those bills and its many amendments. But it was all done constructively and in good faith. Yes, at the end of the day, the Democrats voted for the final product. Most of the Republicans voted no. But if that was the only fact one noticed about the process, one would have missed almost everything that I think matters. The second question relates to lobbyists, and do they have too much power? I think the short answer is yes, they do, but that's not because of anything about lobbyists per se. And this is getting to some of the same points that Ben made a moment ago. Lobbyists are actually indispensable to the process because they have expertise. Legislators are citizens. Most of us have jobs when we aren't in session. With few exceptions, we are not subject matter experts, and we need the help. Also, most bills that we consider do not affect all Oregonians equally. Most bills affect industries or specific groups of people. And personally, I cannot imagine a responsible policymaker not wanting to hear from people and interests who are going to be most affected before voting on bills. So in my view, the problem is not that we have lobbyists representing private interests. That's fine. That's appropriate. The problem is that legislators, who are supposed to weigh all of these interests and then make an independent judgment about the public interest, are often at a disadvantage. We simply don't have the resources to compete with these armies of lobbyists. I had a staff of 2 people. I can't send them off to research every bill. So it can be a struggle just to get the information you need to make a smart and well-informed decision. And that creates the risk that a legislature becomes overly dependent on the information that private interest groups provide. I sponsored a bill this session to create a legislative research office modeled on the Congressional Research Service in Washington, which serves as a professional, nonpartisan policy analysis shop for legislators. We had to put that on the shelf this year because it obviously would cost some money, and we didn't have a lot of that this year for new programs. I think that would be money well spent, and I plan to bring that bill back for consideration next session. My final observation has to do with legislators as leaders and the role the legislature plays in a system where major decisions increasingly are taken from it and resolved through the initiative and referendum. I'm convinced that we cannot continue to try to run the state's finances through ballot measures. Turning the state's budget over to initiative petitioners has severely undermined the legislature's ability to lead the state forward. Fiscal policies that legislators, as elected representatives of the people, end up choosing are overly influenced by the private power concentrated in the hands of unelected, unaccountable initiative petitioners. When complex fiscal questions are decided by yes or no votes on the basis of information that comes from wealthy, unaccountable, and often out-of-state interests, that is not a recipe for good policy or good government. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The City Club has been leading the way on this issue since 1996 with its first report on initiative reform. That report and your report last year have been very influential and guided much of my own thinking on this issue. So I want to thank you for your visionary commitment to the necessary work of reforming this system and returning it to its roots. Fixing this problem requires a sustained commitment over the long term, and you have me as a partner in that effort. Thank you.
Well, clearly we are proceeding in descending order of height. So I'll try to keep it short. Clearly I'm actually not above cheap humor, Representative Garrett. But they've set a high bar, and so I'll just walk right under it. My name is Jules Kopel Bailey. I have the distinct honor of representing House District 42, which is inner East Side Portland. And frankly, there are times when I am riding my bicycle around my district and thinking to myself, really? I get to represent this district? It's the Hawthorne, Belmont, Division neighborhoods up to I-84 down to Reed College, and it is home to some of the most active, brightest, amazing people you could ever hope to meet. And when you are canvassing door to door in House District 42, it is terrifying. Because you knock on the door and you launch into your spiel and you start talking about your vision for transportation or revenue or the environment, and the person stops you and says, you know, I'm executive director of such and such, and boy, do you need to get your facts straight. It is an amazing district to represent, and I thank all the voters there for the opportunity to do it. Down in the legislature, I've had an opportunity to bring some of my background in economics and urban planning and environmental policy to bear on a number of committees. I'm the vice chair of the Revenue Committee. You can, for some of you in the audience, you can hold your fruit for later. I also have the honor of serving on the Transportation Committee, the Sustainability and Economic Development Committee, ably led by Chair Tobias Reed, and the Environment and Water Committee, also ably led by Representative Ben Cannon. So you can tell I had a busy session on those committees. And one of the questions that I get most often from constituents, from friends, from family members is, did you have fun? How was it? How was your first session? And the answer that I give back is, it was much, much harder and much, much more fun than I could have possibly expected. We'll start with the hard part. Your legislature is composed of citizen legislators who come from all sorts of backgrounds and who are injected into a public policy process that is at the same time incredibly intense and incredibly high stakes. The experience of having 8 meetings in 2 hours, back to back to back, 15 minutes, and every one counts. You have 15 minutes to learn and understand an issue, to come to agreement on a complex policy area, to help 2 people who are in disagreement work it out. And you can't miss. And as soon as they're done, the next group comes in. Just getting your sea legs under you with the schedule of up at 5 or 5:30, down in the Capitol for meetings by 7 or 7:30. Meetings, floor, committee, all day long. And you check your email for the first time at 6 or 7 o'clock, and you see the 300 emails waiting for you that you have to respond to in time to get to bed, get up the next morning, and be fresh and on your game for those 8 back-to-back meetings in 2 hours. It is a difficult process that public servants of all levels go through. but the opportunity to serve our constituents, to be able to make a difference in the issues that will shape Oregon's future, that make a difference to people's lives today, that opportunity to serve on behalf of our constituents is an honor that everybody up here and that everybody in the legislature takes very, very seriously, and I'm grateful for it. And we could not make it through this process without mentorship and without guidance. And that's why I'm grateful to Tobias Reed and Ben Cannon, who took me under their wing throughout this last session and taught me the value of listening, of engaging constructively, and of a sense of humor. And one of my lasting memories of Ben Cannon, actually, in committee, this man deals with middle schoolers all day long, which is a fantastic preparation for the legislature. And I have a distinct memory of a bill that we had in front of the Environment and Water Committee on exotic pets. And this debate took a turn for the surreal when we started talking about police monkeys. And at one point, a representative gave a speech on whether or not we should be training monkeys in the martial arts to defend people on the streets. And Ben, normally a pillar of stability in the committee, and I am doing my best to keep a straight face, and I look down the dais, and he is just losing it. And I had to walk out into the hall and have a chuckle and walk back in. So it's not all completely hard work. I want to touch on a couple of themes that some of my colleagues touched on. One is the collegiality and the bipartisanship. There was a City Club report that talked about the need to have greater collegiality and greater bipartisanship in the legislature. This is my first session. I can't tell you what it was like before, but I can tell you that when I look at what is happening at the federal level, that when I hear about the rancorous partisan debate that is happening on health care, not only do I not see that in the Oregon legislature, I can't relate to it. I can't imagine it. We serve with 59 other individuals who are as committed to being down there and serving their constituencies as each one of us is. Whether it's working with Cliff Bentz, a water attorney and expert on water issues who can walk us through the complexities of those issues even if we vote the opposite way. Tim Freeman, a gas station owner from Roseburg who partnered with us on key climate legislation putting Oregonians back to work. We're working with Representative Vicki Berger on the transportation package. There is a spirit of collegiality and bipartisanship where we work together. We don't always vote together, but it means that we build strong relationships and we do have the best interests of Oregon at heart, even if it doesn't reflect on the board. And that really reflected in the work that many of us came to the legislature to do. We worked on a bipartisan package called the Energy Efficiency and Sustainable Technology Act. Representative Reed and I were co-chief sponsors of that bill to put Oregonians back to work through weatherization and retrofits for energy efficiency and renewable energy that resulted in a bill that is good for families, reducing energy costs, putting Oregon workers back on the job, and doing the best possible thing to confront climate change, and that is reducing the energy that we already use. An urban-rural partnership bill that resulted in, as you've heard before, a common theme, a win-win-win for Oregon. The politics of that were easier. The technical details were hard. The opposite applied to our transportation package. The transportation package was a package that had to reflect a wide and diverse array of constituencies and legislators that represent urban and rural Oregon, that represent districts like mine, where you have folks who, 26% of whom commute on a bicycle, and districts like Representative Cliff Bentz, who is from Ontario. Balancing those interests, being in the center of those negotiations, ensuring that we had a bill that was both looking forward and making investments for today was one of the hardest things that I worked on during the legislative session, but one of the ones in which I learned the most. And at the end of the day, the button that you push on your desk is not reflective of the time and energy and work that it takes to balance those competing interests. That was one of my major lessons of the legislature. And at the end of the day, the product that we came out with, I believe, is one that creates jobs and puts Oregon on a path for the future. I'll finish by talking a little bit philosophically. You have before you 4 legislators who are under 35, if I am correct in that. Chris may not be. He's giving me a look. He's 35. The issues that we are confronting are not issues just for our children, they are issues for us. When I think about climate change, when I think about having a higher education system that puts Oregon back on a path to innovation, these are issues that I care about for my children in the future, but they are issues that we will live through and that we will see today, and that brings a certain sense of urgency to our work. We are able to learn from those that we serve with who bring a larger set of experience and understand the value of incrementalism. But what we bring is an ability to know when there is a need for the long pass. And that combination of incrementalism and the long pass, I believe, at the end of the day, is a balance that we struck very well in the last legislative session. I also want to acknowledge another group of young people that serve down in the legislature, and that is our staff. Our staff work incredibly hard day in and day out with little credit. Meredith Shield and Deborah Burke in my office made all the difference in passing the legislation that we were able to pass and keeping us up to speed and in making those 8 back-to-back meetings happen. I encourage all the young people that are out there that have listened to the presentations from the 4 of us today to get involved, to run for office, to serve as staff, to come down and get involved in the legislature. Because at the end of the day, we are there to serve you, and your opinions and your ideas are just as important as the next person. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to the City Club today. It has been a distinct honor, and I want to finish by repeating the themes that you've heard here today: innovation, talent and collaboration, bipartisanship, the ability to work together to create jobs to put us back on track. Thank you very much.
We have a unique host with us to ask the first question of today's panel. Representing City Club's own brand of young leaders, we welcome Naomi Cole, Chair of City Club's New Leaders Council. Naomi works for Construct, a consulting firm that provides sustainable building, planning, and program services. Naomi?
So, as the new hands in Salem, and now that you've got your feet wet, I'm really curious if you are more or less optimistic than before you entered politics. And you've touched on this a bit in your remarks, but I'm wondering if maybe you could mention a few areas where your optimism has evolved as you deal with a lot of these legislative realities that you talk about.
I'll say something. I would say on the whole, my optimism, the level of my optimism has not changed. I think I would pick up on some words that I think Representative Bailey used when he said it's evolved. I think the understanding I have about the difficulties associated with policy development, balancing competing concerns and perspectives, I have a greater appreciation for that and a greater appreciation for how difficult it is to get through that process, but I am more optimistic about the level of commitment that people in Oregon have to working through that process. So I would say that it's a different makeup that comprises my optimism, but no less optimistic.
I work with middle school students. I'm a teacher, and frankly, my optimism comes from them. These are kids, I realized this morning, many of whom have probably never seen images of the Twin Towers falling on September 11th, 2001. They are too young. And their perspective, their clear-headedness, their optimism, their hope is what gives me hope and is one of the virtues of our citizen legislature, despite all the challenges that presents.
We will now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forum is a privilege of City Club membership. When you ask your question, please identify yourself as a member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less.
My name is Tom Cox. I'm a member of the club and I serve on the Board of Governors. Gentlemen, on page 12 of the state's comprehensive annual financial report, we find that the state's agencies are sitting on $4.9 billion in cash, of which 71.5%, or $3.5 billion, is available for spending at the state's discretion. Now, this would seem to mean one of two things. Either the massive, permanent, and some would say job-killing tax increases that you passed were completely unneeded, or the Legislative Fiscal Office has published fraudulent financial numbers. Which of these do you think it is, and what do you plan to do about it?
Thank you for the opportunity to address that question. One of the things that we engaged in the legislative session was a recurring debate on ending fund balances. And the legislature examined that process very carefully in coming up with the balanced budget that we were finally able to pass. Now, I can assure you, even though I don't serve on the Ways and Means Committee, that our co-chairs of Ways and Means are the kinds of people who look under every couch cushion and look in every corner for every last dime before they make the drastic and painful cuts that we had to make in this last legislative session. We made over $2 billion in cuts because of the state of the economy. To complement those cuts, we had to balance the budget by making our tax system more fair, more progressive. And in doing so, we've ensured that Oregon can move forward with stability and move forward in a way that protects public safety, education, and health care. But the reality is that nobody down there likes to make cuts. We had to do it. We didn't enjoy doing it. It was a tough decision. But the notion that there is piles of cash sitting down there in Salem flies in the face of, I think, the professionalism and the hard work that our Ways and Means co-chairs put in the last session.
I'm Ron Cease. I'm a member of the City Club, former state legislator, and chair of both the House and the Senate Environment and Natural Resource Committees. I appreciate what you do, and I also am one of those who believes the last session was a very fine session indeed. When I'm talking about the environmental issue, I want to ask you about the budgets for the natural resource agencies. There are about 7 of them, and I think it's almost criminal what the state has allowed to happen to those budgets over the last number of years. They're decimated. And it is one thing to say that we have a fine environmental record, new environmental laws, but if we don't have agencies that are effectively able to perform their functions, I don't know how you get at the larger question. Part of that also is the fact that those agencies have become too heavily dependent on the people and organizations that they are supposed to regulate. It's not simply a matter of money. It is money, of course, but I think what an additional $50 million would do to those agencies, where is the priority? I'm asking you, what kinds of leadership, what kinds of things can you do to help provide some leadership in figuring out how we fund those agencies so, in fact, Oregon can say we are a very strong environmental state and we put some money behind it?
It's a very good question. It is the case that we have extraordinary environmental challenges, and we have extraordinary state agencies and state workers out trying to help address those. It's also the case that over the last decade and a half, we've had fewer of those folks doing that work in large part because of the competition for limited general fund dollars. This means those agencies have gone up against our needs in education, in human services, in public safety, and very often natural resource agencies have not won. In response, partly in response, you're right, we've shifted the funding of those agencies largely over to fee payers. So for instance, the largest industries in the state are responsible for paying some significant portion of the agency operating costs for the Department of Environmental Quality. And that too has repercussions for the types of policies that DEQ sets and the type of approach that they take. All of those things are of concern. I think that we need to make the case to the public and to our to our counterparts that clean air, clean water, and natural spaces are vital Oregon value, and that we need to invest general fund in order to safeguard those things for future generations.
Thank you.
Hi, Alex Tinker, City Club member. Some of you have mentioned Oregon's tradition as a policy innovator, often implementing the first national firsts with policy and also our pioneering roots. Based on your experience in the last regular session and the efforts to pass various climate-related bills, what do you think are the prospects that in the next session the legislature can pass bills that will continue Oregon's role as a pioneer in building both a local and global economy that is based on clean energy sources?
There might be a little bit of a competition, as all of us are pretty interested in that topic, as to how to answer this. I think there are great prospects for that. We, I think, demonstrated to the nation a new approach with the East legislation that Representative Bailey mentioned that's already gotten national attention. Senator Merkley and Congressman Blumenauer have indicated their intention to pursue national legislation along the same lines. We are in a spot to be able to demonstrate on a whole range of things. We're also the second state, breaking what I said to a certain extent, in the country to enact a solar feed-in tariff. Some people, often refer to state government as the laboratories of democracy, and I think we have the opportunity to continue living up to that by focusing on values and on what sort of state people want to leave to future generations. We have, as you've heard, plenty of opportunity where the mechanics can be a challenge to work through, but people's motivations are very consistent, and by focusing on those motivations, I think we come up with unique solutions.
Ted Kay, City Club member. As Ben noted, serving in the Oregon State Legislature is a part-time job. You're paid a pittance, and we have sessions that are for 6 months every 2 years. A pair of yes-no questions for each of you. Take them in order of height, tallest first. Do you think we should change to a full-time annual legislature? And if we did, would you want to serve?
I guess I'm the tallest. I would say yes to both of those. But the question really I think speaks to a need for each of us to talk to our friends, neighbors, families, colleagues about the work of the legislature and the work of government generally. The scariest stories I hear these days are from a pollster that many of you probably know who talks about focus groups where he asks people to name a service that government provides that is of value to them. And he gets blank stares and silence. So I think it's up to each of us to talk about the work that we do, clean drinking water, law enforcement, libraries, all the things that we have as a result of our investment of shared resources. And once we get to that stage, I think you can make a strong case for a legislature that has more time together and has more resources for whichever perspective you come from. On the one hand, we can respond better to emerging issues, craft innovative policies. On the other hand, we can be a better check on the executive branch and provide better oversight for the operations of state government. So I think it is definitely something we should continue talking about and continue reinforcing to Oregonians.
Yes, we should have a full-time legislature, and I would serve if I could bring my students down and teach them there at least one day a week.
If I heard your question right, it was, should we have an annual full-time legislature? And to me, that's two different questions. I would say annual, yes. Full-time, I'm not so sure. I think we could maintain a part-time citizen legislature, but go to annual sessions. I think that's a good idea, mostly for the oversight reasons that Representative Reed mentioned. Right now, the legislature is just the weakest branch of government because we are gone 18 months every 24 months. And of course, I'd serve.
Shortest last. The answer to your question from my perspective is a yes, but. Yes, I believe in going to annual sessions. Yes, I would love to serve, but we would have to ensure that it can still be a legislature that is open to people who take care of working families, people who have to make ends meet, and so it is not a body of doctors, lawyers, and retirees and wealthy business owners. We want a legislature that represents all Oregonians.
I'm Isabel Sheridan, and I am a member of City Club, and I'm feeling very fortunate to be addressing my question to all four of you because I'm very honored to hear what you're doing. I'm concerned about win-win situations when there's something that has to do with long-term health versus business viability. I'm thinking most recently of the Ash Grove cement plant and the DEQ's response and their most recent response. We want businesses to be here. We want people to be employed. I also want your children and their children to be here. I want there to be fish that people can eat. I want air quality that is acceptable in Portland, and I want it in Idaho, where the winds are blowing from Ash Grove. How do you make it possible for workers and businesses that need to retool or need to go out of business to do something else rather than to just get stuck if you decide to do something for the health of the people in Oregon?
I think you've touched on what is among the most very difficult types of choices that we face as a legislature and as a state. There is no question that jobs are really, really important to people, especially now. And that makes it especially difficult to keep our eye on long-term health issues when to address them would mean the loss of jobs. Fortunately, it's not always the case. It doesn't have to be the case that the two are opposed. We've talked, I think, each of us about some of the policies we've passed that have tried to marry job creation with protecting the environment and with protecting health. And we will, as a matter of political expedience as well as being the right thing, we'll be looking for those kinds of opportunities in the future. Ultimately, I have a 2-year-old daughter. Tobias's child is on the way. I think all of us take a long-term view. I am certainly eager to see the state involved in helping with the retraining and job creation opportunities for folks who may be displaced as a result of environmental laws or regulations. But we've got to do the right thing for the children and future children of Oregon.
I think that's a really profound question, and I'm a firm believer that Oregon's quality of life is one of our great competitive advantages when it comes to developing and nurturing and attracting business. And we can't give that up. We can never sacrifice that for short-term prospects. It doesn't mean, though, that just by maintaining a good quality of life, jobs will be created from thin air. We don't always do a good job in this state of economic development. And I think that in recent years, with our emphasis on identifying clusters where we're strong and innovating, we're creating a lot of reason for hope, but it's something that we have to continue working very hard on.
Melody Rose, City Club member and member of the Board of Governors. I'm very glad to have you here today and glad that you're serving the state of Oregon. I want to ask a question relevant to a front page article from the Oregonian of a few weeks back that talked about the fact that our legislature does not look like Oregon. Many are nodding, you recall this piece. My question, gentlemen, is to ask, now that you've served a term or two in the legislature, is what are the consequences when a legislative body does not look like the state? And what would need to be done in order to increase our diversity in the legislative body?
I appreciate the question. I think it is appropriate, obviously, given the panel that is in front of you today. There's, I think, both a short-term answer and a long-term answer to your question. Obviously, the state benefits when you have a representative body that does truly represent all Oregonians, whether that's from race or gender, socioeconomic background, urban and rural. The legislature is the body that is supposed to speak for all people of Oregon and should be composed of a mix that looks like Oregon. So how do we get there? In the short term, it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we are reaching out to and recruiting and making sure that we're supporting candidates who put themselves out there, who do help increase the diversity of the legislature. In the long term, I also think that we have a responsibility to make sure that the legislature is accessible to people in working families, to making sure that it is that people who are in the legislature are supported in a way that we can have a diverse representation from across the spectrum of Oregonians, and to examine the systemic problems within our own society that often gets in the way of allowing people from diverse groups to be able to have the opportunity to run for the legislature.
Afraid we've run out of time for further questions and we'll have to stop for this week. Please join us on September 18th when neuropsychologist Paul Nussbaum will discuss recent discoveries about the human brain and how this new knowledge is impacting society. As we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's speakers, Tobias Reed, Ben Cannon, Chris Garrett, and Jules Kopel Bailey. We are adjourned.